Welcome at this lesson. Voyage orders. A contract of shipment of cargo is called a charter, and the party or the person who is renting cargo hold space or space within a ship to move goods from A to B is called a charterer. In practice, the ship gets voyage orders, which briefly summarizes the obligations of the master and the crew, and it also briefly states what they will do, what's the route, what's the destination, and some other important parameters which you will learn within year number 1 and 2. Before signing a charter, some crucial information needs to be obtained out of the navigational voyage planning. For example, we need to know roughly the ETA to the loading port, and that's because of the tendering of the notice of readiness. Before we start a new voyage, we need to usually clean the hold of the vessel, and the thoroughness of cleaning depends on the next cargo and the demands of the charterer concerning that cargo. For example, if we load steel scrap, shovel clean, in Dutch bezemschoon, will be sufficient. And usually we distinguish a couple of grades of cleaners, and we use about 4 or 5 grades, and the most cleanest one are hospital clean and grain clean, and they are regularly used for loading bulk which is meant to be for human consumption. So please hit the pause button for a minute or two and read these 4 grades of cleaners. One which is not mentioned is load on top. Some people would say it's not really a grade of cleaners, but it's something we actually use when we prepare a stowage plan. Actually, in some extent, there's another grade, and I usually call this normal clean plus freshwater rinsing, and that's in case we load steel cargo. We won't make the cargo hold grain clean. Nevertheless, if we do normal clean and we only rinse the cargo hold with outboard water, there might be some residue of salt in that water, and the salt will progress the amount of corrosion on steel cargo. So there's a second round of washing in case we load steel cargo, and that's with fresh water. So because of this, the importance of hold cleaning, the senior rank officers will monitor this hold cleaning process meticulously, because there's a lot of money involved in case the cargo hold isn't clean enough by a independent surveyor. So usually shortly after tendering the notice of readiness, some independent surveyor, he will check and inspect the hold for cleanness if it's up to a certain grade. To some high points, he might actually use a drone and video camera to do his inspection. That's something of the recent era. So if we're gonna load directly after the hold cleaning again, the chief officer will be busy with preparing stowage plan and a loading plan. And a loading plan implies the steps of loading and at the same time the steps of deballasting the ship. So the ship will stay within limits concerning shear force and bending moment. When the hold cleaning is finished, the captain usually tenders the notice of readiness with the signature, the date, and the time, with the time zone also mentioned, and the ship stamp. And the default setting for tendering a notice of readiness is when the ship is ready in all aspects, and there are some other moments to sign the notice of readiness. Sometimes it's done at at arrival at the pilot station, but the default setting is ready in all aspects. So it usually means when you're alongside and the hold is clean. Well, the loading or discharging party needs to accept and confirm the notice of readiness. And that's very important, and that has to do with the starting of the late time, in Dutch, the lichttijd. So when it's accepted with a certain time mentioned in the acceptance, the clock for loading or discharging starts running. In case something goes wrong during the survey for the hold cleaning, it usually means that the ship will be in port at his own expenses or at the expenses of the owner of the vessel. So that's something to be aware of, that also in that aspect the hold cleanness is very important. So here an example of the notice of readiness, and here's the time actually mentioned. It might be smart to actually add the time zone within this format. In case you have a legal dispute, it's clearly to all parties concerned what's the time zone you're in. So we continue with some theory about making calculations concerning the stowage plan, loading plan, and leaving seaworthy to sea. There's a third dimension besides the two other ones, the vertical one and the longitudinal one. There's the transverse one, and that one is important concerning the list of the vessel. So we see a ship, center line is mentioned, and point G, the transverse center of gravity, is in the center line. And in that case, the ship doesn't have any list. The ship is in the water without list. Point G is exactly in the center line, and the effective moment transversely with reference to the center line is 0. So clockwise and counterclockwise, the summation of those two are 0. So we use clockwise and counterclockwise in case we speak about transverse moments. So with the Elandsgracht and the Morgenstund, the mass of the cranes causes a clockwise moment which lists the ship, and in this case to starboard. And we need to compensate this list to the other side, and we do it with water ballast. In practice, we compensate the clockwise moment with the counterclockwise moment till the resulting moment is 0 again, and in that case, point G, the transverse center of gravity, is back in the center line again. And we do it with water ballast, usually in the side tank. Here's the water, and in that way we can pull back point G towards the center line, so the list will be 0 again. This is how we like to go to sea. And if we need to do something quickly on board of the ship, we use the automatic healing tanks. And these are two communicating tanks with a big pump in the middle. And with this system, you can bring back the list very quickly back to 0. So some rules of thumb when we design a stowage plan. No flammable cargo next to the engine room bulkhead. That's due to the heat radiation which might be a source of ignition to that flammable cargo. Dangerous goods, they need to be separated according to the IMDG code, and we're going to work with it soon. It's a code where all the dangerous goods are mentioned with their standalone risk, but also their risk if you combine multiple dangerous goods close to each other, and the amount of segregation we can find in this code. Be aware of stack height. In Dutch, we say stapelhoogte. It's actually the amount of tiers you put on top of each other. Here's a small picture. So the lowest tier we call tier number 1 usually. With containers we have another numbering, but the lowest tier we usually call 1. And we need to make sure that tier number 1 is able to withstand the pressure and the force of 3 tiers on top of itself. Something to be aware of. So here we see some lashing. We call this pyramid stowage. Here you see some blocking dunnage vertically, and here on protecting the corner of the lashing, here's something soft over here, and the lashing is done with bulldog grips. So some more rules of thumb. Make blocks of cargo. Usually they are squared because we work with box-shaped cargo holds. It's easier to work as such. Don't waste too much ullage, but keep enough in case you need to ventilate. So sometimes you need to be able to ventilate through cargo to take away moisture or a bad atmosphere. So it needs to be open, usually close enough, but sometimes you need to have some gaps to ventilate sufficient. Here are the blocks. Well, there's a distinction between on-deck cargo and cargo in the hold, and it has to do with insurance, and it's also in relation to the Hague-Visby rules, where we're going to speak about later. So be aware of the Solos line of sight. The good thing is the Morgenstund SARC local PIAS simulator, it's doing it for you. So some parameters concerned is the stack height of cargo on deck and the trim of the ship. And there is actually some rules in Solos for the amount of that angle, the distance over here where you don't have a free view as an officer on deck, and it might be a risk for small vessels. That's the reason. So multiple load or discharge ports, usually it's in cargo, first in is last out. Complicating factor is multiple loads and discharge ports, and in that case we need to think about the discharge sequence later on, and that's something to be aware of in case you design the stowage plan. So try to limit shifting of cargo and or twin decks. Usually you also need to shift the twin decks. And the twin decks, they are actually over here in red. So if we first go to Amsterdam and secondly we go to Rotterdam, it's not very convenient if we put cargo for Amsterdam over here. So the first discharge port cargo should be here. That's most convenient, and that will save you time and effort and shifting of twin decks and maybe even cargo. So be aware of the discharge sequence and the port rotation coming with it. With containers, try to minimize the amount of restows. So in case you need to take a container up, put it somewhere else, and bring it back later on, we call that a restow. Try to minimize the amount of that. Not always possible. Installed twin decks can be used as a sort of a paraplu against drizzle or rain. Nevertheless, the gaps between the twin decks, they are not fully watertight, be aware. Loading plan is a final stowage plan which includes a detailed plan of the loading sequences and amounts combined with the deballasting sequences and amounts. And all the steps, all the weight changes, the officer will check bending moment and shear force, sometimes even torsion, if we stay within the limits. And we have harbor limits and sea condition limits. And usually in the harbor we work with the harbor conditions. Nevertheless, if you go to sea, it needs to comply with the sea conditions. And that has to do with the differences between dynamic loads of waves and swell, etc. The chief officer needs to check all these steps to make sure there's no exceeding of the maximum shear force, bending moment, and sometimes torsion. So here it is. So we actually will check over here if we're in the green zone, if it complies, yes or no. If it doesn't comply, he needs to change something because he will put too much stress on the casco, the steel of the ship, which is not allowed and dangerous. So here an example of a loading plan. At remarks, we can also see some other items which needs to be done by the duty officer. For example, a draft survey or keep a strong beam standby. And all the steps, all the sequences are written down, and also in the fourth column, what to deballast at the same moment. That's it. Thanks for watching.